Hello virtual dreamers, Gregory here. When people say the words virtual reality, I think some kind of first-person gameplay experience is usually what comes to mind. After all, what's the point of going to the virtual world if you're not going to engage with it directly? Well, I ask you to reserve judgment on that position till you've had a chance to try some third-person VR experiences. I just spent a good week focused on those kinds of games myself, and while I'm not ditching Beat Saber or the Sword Art Online dream for it, I came away wanting a few more third-person titles to play than I did before. To understand the dialogue we're going to have here, we first need to clarify what I mean when I say first-person and third-person. In gaming circles, this refers to whether or not you're playing a game where things are seen from the character you control's perspective, or if you're seeing it from a distance away from the character you control. As you can see, there's a pretty distinct difference in the experience between the two in regular gaming, but it's important to note that this difference exists in virtual reality as well. I actually wound up being reminded of this difference during last week's VR experiences. You see, I'd just gotten back from a 4th of July party when I looked at my VR library to decide what games I wanted to play. I'd just beaten Moss, Vader Immortal, and Hatsune Miku VR, and kinda felt like making my way through a few games that had been sitting in my library for quite a while. In this case, I looked through two titles in particular, Lucky's Tale and Chronos. These were among the very first games I had for virtual reality, and they were both designed in the time when Oculus still shipped an Xbox One controller with the Oculus Rift instead of touch controllers. Being that first-person gameplay isn't as easy with that as it is with proper motion controls, there were quite a few games designed around taking advantage of the third-person perspective. Ever since the switch from gamepads to motion controllers, there hasn't really been any looking back for the medium, since the motion control standard was more conducive to you being the controller, rather than using a controller to manipulate another character. While I understand the reasoning, I do think it's a bit unfortunate that more third-person titles took the wayside as a result of this, as the experiences I have that leverage the third-person perspective have actually been pretty good. Last week, I really enjoyed my time with Moss's Storybook World, as it really gives you the impression of playing in front of a small diorama, and the animation effort put on Quill really gave her a lot of life. With Lucky's Tale, the use of a bright, colorful world really made things pop, and it was a pleasure to look at while playing. And with Chronos, they actually take more of an approach of having things be to a normal scale, only occasionally changing out the scales whenever they like, and it really gave things a very visceral and epic feel at times. When you combine that with its use of high quality rendering on more static environments, and I really couldn't help but be sucked into the game world. Even beyond what I've played so far, Astrobot has gained quite a bit of recognition on PlayStation VR, Insomniac's Edge of Nowhere is still on my to-play list, and some more loosely third-person titles like Tetris Effect and Thumper are also registering on my radar. There's definitely a value to playing these kinds of games in VR that we just don't get from a 2D screen. That all being said though, I do understand why it is that third-person and VR aren't more common bedfellows. There are some very apparent limitations and considerations at play for why a developer would rather just not spare the effort for a VR version of a third-person game. To get the obvious one out of the way, a lot of third-person games feature some form of camera controller motion. This may not seem like a big deal, but for people who don't yet have or just can't seem to develop their VR legs, this is a complete deal breaker. A big part of the push for things that annoy VR veterans like myself, such as teleportation movement and one-room game design, is that these things reduce the need for artificial locomotion, and by extension, dramatically reduce the chances of VR sickness affecting a user. I've seen people feel a bit off with as little locomotion as the camera movements from Lucky's Tale, so you can imagine how these people might get on with Monster Hunter World or Breath of the Wild. I think they'd just rather stick to a 2D screen instead, especially since they don't need to put on a bulky headset and can get right into playing with that method. It's also worth recalling here, since we brought up some third-person games, VR has mostly moved away from the focus on using a gamepad or mouse and keyboard of the early days to focus more on using motion controls. Throw in that some VR motion controllers like the Vive ones don't even have thumbsticks, and you end up with a scenario where you're potentially reducing your audience or leaving some members with a bad experience, which isn't desirable in the already limited market of virtual reality. Which leads us to the biggest point of all here, being that third-person games can work almost entirely fine outside of VR. With the exception to Moss and Chronos, just about all of the third-person VR games mentioned either have non-VR versions or sequels that will not be in VR. In a lot of ways, third-person VR is just a better version of 3D gaming, which at just saying those words alone, I probably just triggered quite a few people. Obviously, it's still better than 3D gaming, seeing as you can't just look away and escape immersion, but the gameplay core here would still be mostly identical in a lot of titles, hence why it's not particularly difficult to convert these games from VR to regular gaming. The problem for VR there being that regular gaming has a dramatically larger market. So if the gameplay isn't going to be dramatically altered in most cases, the visual boom just isn't enough of a benefit for most people to care to reduce the convenience factor that they get off of a regular 2D screen. Considering that there are more 2D screens available as well, just what incentive is there for a developer to make a third-person game into a VR title instead? It's like I was saying, I totally get that these factors are holding back the creation of more third-person VR titles. But as a gamer and someone who spends far longer in Unreal Engine and Unity than I should, I think there's still a lot of value to this gameplay form and its exploration. Some of the solutions I've seen in just the past few days of playing the games has made that clear enough for me to see. With the whole VR sickness and artificial camera issue, I find that an argument can be made just as well that third-person titles have just as many solutions to these issues as the first-person ones currently do. In Moss, they took the simple approach of basically using the screen-to-screen loading transition to get us to static points where artificial locomotion isn't necessary. In Chronos, they went with a bit of an old-school solution, oddly enough, having us jump between different camera positions based on our location in the level, in a manner not unlike the old Resident Evil games. While not always a smooth process since the direction you're going between screens sometimes doesn't blend ideally, it worked well enough most of the time that I just got to focus on the gameplay and still appreciated the unified structure of the world. Of course, any title that's just a single level without any need for moving between areas regularly would work just fine. So yeah, can we get that VR Yu-Gi-Oh! Pokemon Stadium or Pokemon Snap now, please? When you consider as well that some VR veterans like myself almost never get VR sick, and having the opportunity to try out more games, traditional third cameras or not, would still be appreciated. As for the whole VR controls not being leveraged bit, I think it's easy to forget that there are some advantages that the new perspective gives for traditional gaming that make it well worth using in VR, even if the motion controllers sit mostly unused or we have to go back to traditional control systems. A lot of the games I've played in third-person VR are platformers, and I think a good reason for that is that VR is the ideal format for this kind of gameplay. While there are ways to work around it, depth perception isn't always a perfect thing on 2D displays, often necessitating tricks to help you get a better feel for whether or not you'll make it to the platform you're hoping to. By comparison, you have complete depth perception in VR thanks to 3D, so there really aren't any judgment issues to be had beyond making sure you time and correctly apply force in your jumps. Motion controls may be the coming standard for VR and AR, but that doesn't mean regular gaming is going anywhere anytime soon, so we may as well leverage that harmony. Throw in that the direction of mobile VR may soon lead us to having headsets comfortable and light enough to be worn all the time, and we may see ourselves in a situation where we can just ditch our TVs in exchange for display glasses that allow us to play wherever we want, however we want, using whatever control schemes we want for the best effects. Ultimately, I think one of the best arguments in favor of increasing the prevalence of third-person VR titles, or modes in regular games that allow us to enjoy third-person games with VR cameras, is that it gives us a new lens through which to enjoy the worlds we already love. I've said it in the past, but the VR of today is unmatched in letting us appreciate virtual environments. The amount of effort and detail that goes into the virtual worlds that we just breeze by and ignore often enough in 2D feels almost criminal, and I think it sucks that some fears about VR sickness, a desire for using the VR motion controls, or a few bugs here and there means that we don't get to experience more things using VR. Honestly, it really makes me want to just try out more injector software like Vorpex, or to go back and use Dolphin's VR mode, just to appreciate some of the splendor of the virtual worlds I love already. Considering the amount of time I poured into Fire Emblem Three Houses, Persona 4 Golden, and Pokemon Alpha Sapphire recently, I can't help but wish we'd have a way to get these kinds of games in VR sooner rather than later. In the end, I don't really expect third-person games to dominate the VR space at any point. They're a niche within a niche, and I think it'll be on us, the VR community, to support the few good titles that do come our way to continue to get the kind of products we want. I do want to invite anyone who hasn't tried out a third-person VR game yet to give it a shot though. It may not seem like something you'd like on the surface, but you'd be surprised how quickly it can convince you otherwise. If nothing else, I think there's a value to getting the idea that VR equals first-person gameplay out of our heads sooner rather than later. After all, I'd rather be a Pokemon trainer than the Pokemon in most occasions. Thank you very much for watching this video, my dear viewer. Be sure to rate, comment, share, and subscribe to make sure that YouTube algorithm someone knows to make our paths cross again. Till next time, my fellow adventurers and dreamers, this has been Gregory, logging out.